Chapter 1. Mirror. Alara stared at her reflection, but Dr. Anya's face stared back. The bathroom mirror felt like a stranger's window now, stretch marks mapping unfamiliar territory across olive skin that wasn't hers, breasts that hung lower than she remembered on her own body. She traced the fine lines around eyes that had seen 45 years instead of her 32, wondering for the 100th time if freedom was worth living in this borrowed flesh. The fluorescent lights of the hospital bathroom cast harsh shadows across Dr. Anya's features that Alara now wore like an ill-fitting dress. Where her own body had been lithe and graceful, with high cheekbones and full lips that drew admiring glances, Dr. Anya's form carried the comfortable softness of middle age. Her hips were wider, marked with silvery stretch marks from pregnancies Alara hadn't experienced. Her breasts, though full, lacked the pertness Alara had once taken for granted. She ran her hands over the unfamiliar curves, remembering how it felt to inhabit her own perfect body. "Mom, are you okay in there?" Sarah's voice, her new daughter's voice, filtered through the door. "Just a minute, sweetie." The words felt foreign in her mouth, even after 6 months. She'd practiced Dr. Anya's slight Eastern European lilt until she could maintain it even in her sleep. But it still felt like playing dress-up in someone else's life. She missed her own voice, the melodic American accent that had once charmed everyone around her. She splashed water on her face, this face, and straightened Dr. Anya's white coat. The hospital ID badge read, Dr. Anya Petrov, Chief Psychiatrist, complete with that stern photograph that had once intimidated Alara from the other side of a metal desk. Now she wore that authority like armor, dispensing the same medications that had once kept her docile and confused in the facility. The irony wasn't lost on her. Every morning was the same routine now. Wake up beside Mark, Dr. Anya's husband, try not to flinch when he kissed her good morning with his coffee-soured breath. Shower in this borrowed body, attempting to avoid looking too long at its imperfections. Drive Sarah to school in the silver Volvo that still felt like someone else's car. Then come to work at Ravencrest Psychiatric Hospital, where everything had started. Last night had been particularly difficult. Mark had been amorous, his hands roaming over what he thought was his wife's body. Alara had closed her eyes, trying to disconnect from the sensation of his rough palms against skin that didn't feel like hers, his eager kisses that tasted wrong. She'd gone through the motions, making the right sounds at the right times, but inside she'd been screaming. It wasn't just that Mark wasn't attractive. He was pleasant-looking enough for a man in his late 40s. It was that every touch felt like a betrayal. Not of Caspian, though there was that too, but of herself. Through the windows of her office on the 6th floor, she could see the East Wing where she'd spent 3 years of her life as a patient. The Gothic architecture of Ravencrest loomed against the gray morning sky, its stone facade unchanged since the 1800s. This had been her prison, and now it was her fortress. The one place she could keep an eye on her old body, inhabited by the real Dr. Anya, whose increasingly lucid moments threatened to expose everything. A knock at her office door pulled her from her thoughts. "Dr. Petrov?" The nurse's voice was hesitant. "Your 9 o'clock is here." Alara smoothed down her coat and squared her shoulders. "Send them in." The door opened, and her heart stopped. Caspian stood in the doorway, and even after everything, the sight of him still took her breath away. He wore his orderly's uniform like it was designer clothing, the plain blue fabric somehow emphasizing his broad shoulders and narrow waist. His dark hair was styled in that deliberately messy way that made her fingers itch to run through it, and his jawline could have been carved from marble. But it was his eyes that held her. Deep brown with flecks of gold, they seemed to see straight through Dr. Anya's face to the real her underneath. His presence filled the room like smoke, making it hard to breathe. She could smell his cologne, sandalwood and something darker, mysterious. The same scent that used to linger on her skin after their encounters in the East Wing's forgotten corners. "Good morning, Doctor," he said, his voice carrying that hint of danger that only she could detect. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. He knew. Of course he knew it was her behind Dr. Anya's face. He'd taught her how to do this, after all. I believe we have some matters to discuss about patient care in Ward C. Ilara's hand instinctively moved to the drawer where she kept the sedatives. In the corridor beyond him, she caught a glimpse of her own body, now occupied by the real Dr. Anya, being led back to the secure ward. The sight was jarring, watching her former self shuffle past in hospital slippers, wild-eyed and muttering about stolen identities. Her once beautiful face was bare of makeup, her long dark hair tangled and dull. Even from here, she could see how the medications kept her former body sluggish and compliant. She forced herself to meet Caspian's gaze. "Close the door, please." The lock clicked with a finality that sent shivers down her spine. Caspian moved toward her desk with that fluid grace she remembered so well. Even in the simple act of sitting down, he managed to exude a predatory elegance that made her pulse quicken. "You're looking well," he said softly, his eyes roaming over Dr. Anya's face. "The role suits you, though I must say, I miss your real face." "What do you want, Caspian?" She tried to keep her voice steady, professional, aware of the security cameras in the corners of her office. He leaned forward, close enough that she could see the individual flecks of gold in his eyes. "You know what I want, Ilara. I want you back. This game you're playing, living as Dr. Petrov, playing house with her husband, trying to forget who you really are, it needs to end." His proximity was intoxicating. Despite everything, despite knowing how dangerous he was, despite the possessiveness that had driven her to steal Dr. Anya's life, her body responded to him. Even in this borrowed flesh, she could feel the pull between them, the electric current that had drawn them together from the first moment they'd met. "It's not a game," she managed to say, though her voice was shakier than she'd like. "And I'm not coming back." His smile deepened, showing perfect white teeth. "No? Tell me, how's life as the good doctor? Enjoying her husband's embraces? Those mundane family dinners? The PTA meetings?" He reached across the desk, his fingers brushing against her hand. Even that slight touch sent sparks through her nervous system. "You can't tell me you don't miss us. Miss this." Images flashed through her mind. Stolen moments in empty therapy rooms, his hands on her body, the way he'd made her feel more alive than she'd ever felt before. The passion, the danger, the sheer intensity of their connection. Compared to that, life as Dr. Anya felt like watching television through static. But then other memories surfaced. His growing possessiveness, the way he'd monitor her interactions with other patients, how his tender touches had started to feel like chains. The day she'd realized she had to escape, even if it meant taking someone else's life. She pulled her hand away. "That's enough. If you don't have actual business to discuss regarding Ward C, I'll have to ask you to leave." He stood slowly, smoothing down his uniform. "As you wish, doctor. But remember, I taught you everything you know about body swapping. Did you really think I wouldn't be able to find you, no matter whose face you wear?" The threat hung in the air between them. Outside her window, storm clouds gathered over Ravencrest's Gothic spires. Thunder rolled in the distance, a low warning of things to come. "You can't touch me here," she said, but they both knew it wasn't true. He could touch her anywhere, anytime. That was the problem. He moved to the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "By the way, I heard an interesting rumor about your past. Something about a child? A tragedy?" He watched her face carefully. Funny how those memories still haven't come back, isn't it? Ilara's head throbbed. There was something there, just out of reach. The sound of a child's laughter, the smell of smoke, a scream that might have been her own. But like always, the memories slipped away like water through her fingers. "Get out," she whispered. He left, but his presence lingered like a ghost. Ilara sat at her desk, trembling, aware that she was trapped in a game of cat and mouse, where she wasn't sure if she was the cat or the mouse anymore. She pulled out her prescription pad and began writing. She'd need to increase the dosage on her former body. Dr. Anya was becoming too lucid, her ramblings too coherent. Soon someone might actually listen to her claims about stolen identities and body swapping. The rest of the day passed in a blur of patient consultations and paperwork. By the time she left the hospital, the storm had broken, rain pelting against the windshield of Dr. Anya's Volvo as she drove home. Home. Such a strange word for a place that belonged to someone else. Sarah was at soccer practice, so the house was empty except for Mark. She found him in the kitchen, cooking dinner, humming tunelessly to himself. He turned when she entered, his face lighting up with a love meant for another woman. "There's my beautiful wife," he said, moving to kiss her. Ilara accepted the kiss, trying not to think about Caspian's words, trying not to compare Mark's soft domestic affection with the consuming fire she'd known before. Mark's hands settled on her hips, Dr. Anya's hips, and she felt the familiar guilt twist in her stomach. "Rough day?" he asked, noticing her tension. She managed a smile, just tired. Later, in bed, she lay awake listening to Mark's steady breathing. Her mind wandered to the locked safe in her office at Ravencrest, the one labeled memory that she hadn't yet managed to open. What secrets did Dr. Anya keep there? What truths about Ilara's past might be hidden in those files? And somewhere in the night, in a secured ward of Ravencrest Psychiatric Hospital, her own body lay in a hospital bed, inhabited by a woman whose life she'd stolen, while the man who'd taught her how to do it walked the halls, waiting, watching, planning. This was her life now. Running from the man she'd once loved, hiding in another woman's skin, trying to piece together the fragments of a past she couldn't quite remember. Something about a child. Something about a death. Something about a husband who had sent her away. But with Caspian's visit today, none of that seemed to matter. Even now, even after everything, she could feel that pull. The gravitational force of him that had drawn her in from the beginning. The way he looked at her, as if he could see through Dr. Anya's face to the real her underneath, made her wonder if she was still running towards something instead of away. Thunder crashed outside, and in the darkness, Ilara touched her unfamiliar face and wondered how much longer she could keep running.